need to take advantage of what just happened because certain players are producing at unsustainable levels. Translation, their high fantasy points aren't going to continue. So here are 12 players who fit this mold that you need to trade away immediately. And we begin with Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons, who you need to trade away after his week 2 performance. London went out there and had a nice game on 7 targets, 18.7 fantasy points. And if you actually watch this game, he was fantastic. He was getting open deep and he was winning a difficult matchup against Packers cornerback Jair Alexander. But we know London's talent has never been the issue. It's the fact that this offense just wants to run the ball. In fact, the Falcons ran 45 times week 2, despite trailing often in the second half, and the time just kept on ticking. I mean, check this out. In a game where Atlanta was trailing by 2 scores in the 3rd and 4th quarter, Desmond Ridder only throws 32 times. They said, no, let's keep running because honestly, it was working. So this might have been best case scenario for Drake London, and still the offense only throws 32 times. Now, it did still lead to a solid game for London, so let's take a look at his usage. According to the Fantasy Life data, in week 2, London ran 84% of the routes, and it led to a team high 28% of the targets. Now, that's very good, but 28% of the targets isn't like a 12 or 13 targets like it is on some other teams. It's 7 here on Atlanta because they throw so little. So Drake London's best case scenario just happened. The Falcons threw 30 plus times, and Kyle Pitts only had 4 targets, and he still didn't break 20 fantasy points. If this is his best case scenario, I want to get away from Drake London immediately and sell him off of this solid game. Now, similar things can be said for this next tight end, and that'll be TJ Hockenson of the Vikings. And I want to make this clear. If you want to hold on to Hockenson because the tight end position is weak, that's fine. You can completely do that, but I think you have a window to sell him, and here's why. Hockenson just finished as the tight end 1 on the week in week 2 against the Eagles, who lost all of their starting linebackers in free agency. Hockenson produced 25.5 fantasy points and 2 touchdowns on 8 targets. Look, his usage remained strong according to Fantasy Life. He actually saw his routes increase from 77% to 80% in week 2, and this led to a total of 15 targets through the first 2 games. However, he's still competing for targets with Justin Jefferson, maybe the best target earner in the game, and even Jordan Addison now, who's looked great, the rookie first-round pick through 2 weeks. And Addison is quickly becoming more involved. In week 1, he ran 66% of the routes. That increased to 78% of the routes in week 2. He's seen a long touchdown in both of these games, and he's not even a full-time player yet. He's going to become a full-time player maybe as soon as week 3 and start to earn more targets than what KJ Osborne is currently earning as the wide receiver 2. And these targets are going to directly cut into the production and upside of TJ Hockenson. So if you're looking for a window to sell him, now is the time. And it's also time to sell Raheem Mostert, who, look, this channel, we are lovers of Raheem Mostert. He has won us 2 bets the first 2 weeks. He has been in all of our fantasy lineups and produced lovely. But we must address that his production is just not sustainable. According to Pro Football Focus, Raheem Mostert is currently the 3rd luckiest running back in the NFL, meaning that he is currently, based on his numbers and role, averaging 70% more fantasy points than he's expected to. Now, you could see some of the other running backs on this list are guys like Aaron Jones over 1 game and Christian McCaffrey. These are extremely efficient running backs who have a large sample of being efficient. Raheem Mostert's also a career efficiency running back, but we can't trust him as much from an injury standpoint and some other things that we'll address now. For starters, he hasn't had much competition so far because Jeff Wilson's been on IR, and the rookie Devon Achane just hasn't been able to get a role carved out. Now, that's not Raheem Mostert's problem. He's gone out there and seen a good role. He's played 73% of the snaps this season, seen 58% of the rush attempts, and 65% of the routes run. That's great. This is probably as good as it will get, though. Mostert has averaged 18.5 fantasy points through 2 weeks, which is top 5 amongst running backs. And he's had a very impressive 5.7 yards per touch, but of course, it's a small sample through 2 weeks on just 31 touches. I'm just going to bet against him finishing as a top 10 running back, and if you believe that too, now's the time to sell him. And here's the deal. Like we mentioned earlier, Jeff Wilson is expected to and is planning on coming off of the IR after week 4, and his own head coach has claimed that he loves his quote-unquote thunder that Jeff Wilson brings. And last season, Wilson was the main red zone back for this Miami Dolphins team, and he played more snaps than Mostert when both were healthy. And there's also the risk that I mentioned of Mostert in injuries. He's over 31 years old, so an older running back, and he has a lot of injury history. He's missed 22 games since 2020. Now is the time to sell. Now, we got to talk about this next wide receiver who had a very, very interesting week 2. And if you're finding this content helpful, make sure you hit the subscribe button because then it'll let you see all my future videos. And that player who had a crazy week 2 is Christian Kirk, because in week 1, he put up just 1.9 fantasy points and he let a lot of people down. But in week 2, it was the complete opposite. He goes for 11 catches, 110 yards on 14 targets. He was the #1 wide receiver on the Jacksonville Jaguars by a mile. And when you start to look into the data on Fantasy Life, in week 1, he only ran 66% of the routes. In week 2, it was 84% of the routes, leading to a massive 36% target share. So it makes you wonder, did he take the wide receiver 2 job from Zay Jones? The answer is sadly no. Zay Jones is still a wide receiver 2 on this team, and here's what happened. Jones saw his routes run go from 94% in week 1 to just 62% in week 2, but it was because he was dealing with injury. He missed some time in this game with an injury. And Calvin Ridley also saw 21% fewer routes in this game because because he got banged up as well, which means Christian Kirk was the only fully healthy receiver for the entire game for Trevor Lawrence, who threw 40 plus times in this game. So now it starts to make more sense why he saw such a high total and more routes run. To make this simple for you, when Zay Jones and Calvin Ridley were out there, Kirk was still not involved in 2 wide receiver sets, which means he's just going to see less overall snaps moving forward next week. And Jacksonville's not going to be 6-point underdogs in many games moving forward. So you're going to see the usage that you saw week 1 most of the time. Maybe not such low targets and fantasy points, but low routes run. And Ridley and Zay Jones probably won't get banged up in the exact same game together moving forward. Sell Christian Kirk. And now this one is a major concern, and you have to sell him immediately. Out of all the guys that we talked about, this is the biggest concern, and it's DJ Moore. Because through 2 games, DJ Moore ranks 83rd in wide receiver usage, behind guys like Demario Douglas, Dontavian Wicks, and Brandon Johnson. Yes, those 3 receivers are in the NFL. Now, lucky for you, DJ Moore put up a nice performance on 7 targets over 100 yards, which gives you this opportunity to sell him, and you need to move fast. Because this Bears offense has not improved since last year. The play calling is poor, the offensive line is still bottom 10, and Justin Fields, through the first 2 weeks, ranks 29th in quarterback accuracy. I mean, you can see the guys below him: Kenny Pickett, Desmond Ridder, Zach Wilson, Bryce Young. This is the category that he is in. He is just not a great passer. Now look, it's true that Moore's role is fantastic. You can see here in both games, he ran 94% of the routes. He earned 24% of the targets in this past game, but similar to a guy we talked about earlier in Drake London, the target share being high doesn't matter when your team's not throwing that much. The disappointing part for DJ Moore is that Chicago has trailed by 2 scores in the second half in each of their first 2 games, and Moore still has just 8 targets this season. This might be DJ Moore's best game of the entire season, believe it or not, so now's the time to sell him. And now let's discuss Brian Robinson, who, look, he's had a fantastic start to the season so far. Through 2 games, according to Fantasy Life, he's played 57% of the snaps and seen a pretty elite 79% of the Commanders' rush attempts. This has led to Robinson producing 13.6 fantasy points week 1 and 28.9 points week 2. This is pretty wild, but through the first 2 weeks, he trails only Kyren Williams, which is wild in its own right, and Christian McCaffrey in running back fantasy points. He ranks 3rd overall. But according to Pro Football Focus, he's earned 36% more points than expected. He's gotten a little bit lucky, and there's a reason for this. He's seen some early season touchdown luck, scoring 3 touchdowns in 2 games. That's not going to continue, and his receiving production has been highly efficient despite not running a lot of routes. As you can see right here, Robinson's only ran 39% of the routes. This has mostly been Antonio Gibson's role as a pass catcher, but despite this, Robinson has 50 receiving yards and a touchdown through 2 games, which isn't going to sustain on this low of usage. Look, there's no doubt about it that this fella is a fantasy starter, an RB2, or at worst a flex option moving forward. But if you're trying to sell high on him when he's a top 5 running back as he is right now, now is the window, because heading into this upcoming week, Robinson is a 6-point underdog, which is the exact game environment where Antonio Gibson will see less snaps, and less snaps and touches will be there for Robinson. So now is the perfect time to sell him before that happens. Now, I probably don't got to tell you this, but you do need to try and trade Garrett Wilson, and you probably already know that. Look, he's had a good start to the season, averaging over 15 fantasy points per game, even though it's completely unsustainable. Through Wilson's first 2 games, he's been expected to score just 11 fantasy points, which, as you can see right here, ranks 38th amongst wide receivers. That's not good at all. That means he's literally like the wide receiver 38 in the rankings if you were to have rankings for this upcoming week, right around there. However, because of some crazy and unsustainable touchdowns each of the first 2 games, he's been able to produce 15 fantasy points per game. Week 1, he had a fantastic touchdown catch on an underthrown ball, and week 2, the Cowboys defender just missed a tackle and he took it to the house for a 70-plus yard touchdown. Look, Wilson is elite. We already know that. This has nothing to do with Wilson, but you spent a 2nd-round pick on him, and now he's valued as like a 6th or a 7th-round pick, and you have a small window since he's scored fantasy points the first 2 weeks to trade him. He's basically like the wide receiver 30 now in fantasy for the rest of the season because of Zach Wilson. Wilson currently ranks through 2 weeks 33rd in quarterback accuracy. Yes, there's only 32 NFL teams, and he's bottom 3 in PFF quarterback grades with guys like Bryce Young and Desmond Ridder. And this is exactly where a guy like Garrett Wilson should be viewed, as a Drake London type of a player now, because of the fact that he has a bad quarterback like Drake London has in what is going to be a very run-first offense. Literally, if you take away the 70-plus yard touchdown last week for Garrett Wilson, he has 1 catch for 15 yards, and he scores you 2 to 2.5 fantasy points depending on your league scoring. That's atrocious. And look at this tweet right here. This should make you want to go and send 5 trade offers right now and get Garrett Wilson off your team. Only 43% of Garrett Wilson's targets were catchable in week 2. This was last out of any wide receiver with 5+ targets because of how bad Zach Wilson has been. So if it's not obvious yet, you need to sell Garrett Wilson as soon as you can. And you're going to say, oh, I won't get much for him. Yeah, that's exactly right. If you can get a Kyren Williams for him, that's elite at this point. Now we can move to a veteran, and it's Adam Thielen, who actually had a solid week 2 for the Panthers. The 33-year-old wide receiver had 9 targets. He puts up over 20 fantasy points because he found the end zone. Overall, not a crazy performance, just 7 catches for 54 yards, piling up a lot of short targets, basically. Now, his usage is solid so far, and that's what he was paid to be. He was given a pretty big contract for a 32-year-old wide receiver at the time that he signed it. Through the first 2 games, Adam Thielen is 2nd on the team with 74 routes. You see Terrace Marshall and DJ Shark, they've split the routes because Shark returned week 2. Jonathan Mingo the most on the team with 77, and Adam Thielen is second in targets with 11. So he's a full-time player, seeing a decent amount of usage. And through 2 games, we've basically seen the floor, a 3-point game week 1, and the ceiling, a 20-point game week 2 of Adam Thielen. So his average outcome is probably closer to like 9 or 10 fantasy points in this offense, which isn't all that great, and it lacks upside for a few reasons. The one reason right here is that Bryce Young in PFF grades ranks dead last right now, 33rd overall, and he's also bottom 3 in accuracy, completing just 52% of his passes. And here's the other reason that there's not a lot of upside. It took 7 receptions for Adam Thielen to get 54 yards. He's older, he's less explosive, he's slower, and this showed on the film from the week 2 game. Check out this stat on Fantasy Life right here. Through 2 weeks, your ADOT, your average depth of target, how deep downfield you're being targeted on average. Adam Thielen is 4th amongst these receivers, just 5.6 yards. Look at the other receivers, 10 for DJ Shark, 14.5 for Terrace Marshall, 15.5 for Jonathan Mingo. He's basically just being used as like a check down running back. And in some situations, that's a good role because you can pick up yards after the catch. But when you're 33 years old and lack that same burst and agility that you had at 25, it's just not the same. It leads to less upside. So the takeaway is to trade Adam Thielen off this 20-point game. And there's always people saying, oh, nobody wants to trade for Adam Thielen. Yes, they do. They just don't want to trade you Justin Jefferson for him like you send in these offers. Send a fair deal. And speaking of a fair deal, if you want to win your fantasy league and take home the championship, the Fantasy Blueprint is for you. I will send you all the tools and analysis you need every single day of the week. As you can see right here, Monday through Friday, a different piece, whether it's projections, game by game notes, waiver wire tiers and rankings, it's going to help you win your league in the Blueprint. Now you could join the now over 2,000 people who are currently using this Blueprint to win their league by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description below. It's quite simple to get. And it's only $5 for the entire year. And if you don't make your fantasy playoffs, which that's obviously the goal here, many of you, if not all of you will, but some injuries and some things happen. If you don't make your fantasy playoffs, I'll just refund that $5. This is risk-free. You might as well get the tool that's going to help you beat your buddies risk-free. And a reminder, you can do it by just scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description below to access your Blueprint today. Now, the next man up is DeAndre Swift, and I'm actually not going to tell you to trade away. My analysis here is to hold DeAndre Swift, and I'm mentioning this because I'm getting a ton of questions on Swift. And here's the deal about DeAndre Swift. Yes, it was clear to start him on Thursday Night Football. We were talking about that in our Discord because there was no Gainwell, and the next guy in line was Swift based on the week 1 usage. Then you throw in the fact that he was a 6-point favorite at home on a short week, and Boston Scott got hurt in the game. Yeah, it was the makings of a breakout game. And that's exactly what happened for Swift. He has 31 touches, unreal, 180 plus yards, and he pops off as the running back 1 on the week. Now, here's what we know about this situation. Swift won't see 31 touches again, and Boston Scott and Kenneth Gainwell will likely return week 3. What we don't know is if Swift will continue to see an RB1 workload. Based on his head coach Nick Sirianni's track record with the Colts and last year with the Eagles, he's probably not going to see a full workload. This is what Miles Sanders did in 2022 with the Eagles in 17 games. He goes for over 1,200 rushing yards. With his receiving yards, it was 1,300. So he has 1,300 yards, and what does he do? Even 11 touchdowns. A great season. Doesn't even finish as a top 20 running back. The 21st overall in fantasy. Why? Because he doesn't get receptions. Jalen Hurts doesn't throw to the running backs, and Nick Sirianni likes to rotate backs. He even rotated with Jonathan Taylor in his rookie year. So I personally think Swift should continue to play. He's always been an efficient running back, but Nick Sirianni loves Gainwell and has a role for Boston Scott as well. So if you have DeAndre Swift and your goal is to try and sell him high right now for a more stable piece, hats off to you. I don't think that's a terrible idea, but I'm personally holding him right now because of what he did last week. If he even just sees 60% of that workload, he's an RB1 this year. Now, this next guy hasn't even played yet this season, and I already want to trade him. And that's going to be the Packers wide receiver, Christian Kirk. Like we said, he hasn't played. He practiced last Friday, meaning that he's on his way to potentially playing week 3. Now, my concern for Watson is just the offensive philosophy around him this season with Jordan Love as the quarterback. But before we break into that, let's talk about what Watson did in his rookie year. Watson was healthy for 7 games and averaged 18.1 points in these contests and was a top 10 wide receiver during this time. So he's proven he could be insanely efficient, but can he continue some of the stuff he did from last year? Because in 7 healthy games, he had 9 total touchdowns, 7 through the air and 2 rushing. That just doesn't seem like something you can continue to sustain in this offense. And we showed this last week from Hayden Winks on Twitter. He's a great follow. You should follow him. But the neutral pass rate, still through 2 games now, the Packers rank bottom 3 in neutral pass rate, which means when the game is close, within 1 score or tied, they're choosing to run the ball at the 3rd highest rate in the league. This is extremely concerning for any of the passing game weapons. And last week, Jordan Love only threw 25 times in the game. So like we discussed with DJ Moore and Drake London, even if you're going to see a 25% target share for Christian Watson, it might only lead to 5 or 6 targets. And then you consider that Christian Watson might have more competition this year. There's no Allen Lazard yet, but Jaden Reed is there. He looks fantastic. He leads the Packers in targets through 2 weeks and had over a 40% target share last week. And Romeo Doubs is playing banged up and still producing. Not to mention Aaron Jones was producing touchdowns as a receiver out of the slot week 1, and the Packers actually have a legit tight end this year. So if this heavy run approach keeps up for the Packers, which I do think it will be, Matt LaFleur reminder, the head coach for the Packers was with the Titans as their offensive coordinator, and he loves to run the ball and use play action. I think they're going to continue to run, which hurts Watson's upside. And if it hurts Watson's upside, it also hurts another teammate of his, and that would be the rookie Jayden Reed, who we mentioned. Yes, I think Jayden Reed is absolutely fantastic through the first 2 games, but Christian Watson's going to return. They're going to kind of eat into each of their target shares, and Jayden Reed produced 2 touchdowns last week. That's why he was so dynamic for fantasy. The rookie looks great on tape, and Matt LaFleur is scheming him open, but what are you going to do when you're only seeing 4 or 5 targets a week in most games? As we discussed earlier in the waiver wire video, I think Jayden Reed is a great pickup and trade candidate. Now, I also want to be trading still Dameon Pierce, even if you're trading him kind of low at this point. Look, he hasn't had the fairest shake. He's down 4 offensive linemen. This team is using 3 running backs, but that's a concern for fantasy because in week 1, they used these 3 running backs. It was Mike Boone as the pass catcher playing 31% of the snaps. Devin Singletary played nearly 30% of the snaps and was used on early downs with Dameon Pierce, who Dameon Pierce saw no passing game usage, even though they hinted at that in the preseason. And then the split got even worse in week 2. You could see Pierce played slightly fewer snaps, 47% of the snaps, saw the similar rush attempts at 63%. It wasn't Mike Boone seeing the passing down work this week, but it was Devin Singletary in the 2-minute offense and Dare Ogunbowale as the passing down primary back. And like we mentioned, Pierce is running behind an offensive line that's already down 4 starters. It was down 3 starters in week 1, and then Laramie Tunsil missed in week 2, so 4 starters. They ranked 25th in run blocking. Brutal. Pierce himself ranks 52nd in running back grades, and he has not produced in fantasy. He scored just 5.5 and 6.7 points the first 2 weeks. Look, as Stevie Breezy points out on Twitter, he's going to say, what do you want me to do? I'm going to get a top pick for pennies on the dollar? And my answer is yeah, because it's going to be potato chips on the dollar soon if this continues. There's new expectations here. It's a brutal offensive line. Pierce isn't playing all that well, and they're using 3 running backs. Yes, trading him for something lesser than his value 2 weeks ago makes sense. Now, Mike Evans will make this list, and it's for similar reasons to DeAndre Swift. I want to hold Mike Evans. I actually, more so compared to Swift, have less questions about Mike Evans' role this season. This dude is coming off of a week where he was the wide receiver 2, putting up over 170 receiving yards, and now so far through the first 2 games, only Puka Nacua has more fantasy points than him at the position. His role has been fantastic so far. He's earned a couple of end zone targets and all the downfield usage from Baker Mayfield. Mike Evans ranks 2nd in air yards so far this season, only behind T. Higgins. He's earned 47% of the Bucs air yards, so he has the downfield usage and he has some end zone targets, which means Evans has the fantasy cheat codes at the wide receiver position. And I know what you're saying, oh, Baker Mayfield will fall apart soon. Well, maybe he will, but here's why I don't think so. As you could see from my tweet right here, Baker is the 3rd highest graded quarterback through 2 weeks, and it's because a big part of this, his new offensive coordinator, Dave Canals from Seattle, is there now coaching his ass off. He did the same thing with Geno Smith last year. He developed Geno Smith. He's doing that with Baker this year, giving Baker a lot of easy throws. That's why Baker is completing 69% of his passes. So the Bucs receivers and Mike Evans and even Chris Godwin, who's a buy low candidate, I want to hold on to them for the time being. So in this video, we talked about a bunch of players you need to trade away, but who do you trade them for? Well, this video right here will have 12 players that you want to trade for before week 3. Now, before you go, if you enjoyed this content, I appreciate you being here. I love doing this so much, and we're pushing towards 100,000 subscribers. So if you can hit the subscribe button before you go, it helps me, but it'll also help you see my future content so you can schmack around your buddies. That one kind of